Welcome to the Gentleman Gunner. Now today I bring you the PX4. Now the PX4 has already been out for quite some time, in fact over 2 decades, which is a reflection of the design of that era. But there is a reason why it's having a resurgence in the past couple of years, and that's because this platform has a ton of potential from a shooting experience. Now the gun I worked on for this video was this particular one, and this one's in 40 cal. And I'm going to use this as the basis to say, did adding these parts do an improvement from the baseline? Now I am going to talk on my PX4, which you've seen me do a review on, and as well as include my full-size model as well. And the idea of that is to have a well-rounded discussion, because not everybody's going to have 40 in this day and age, but you may have 9. First thing I want to talk about is the entire trigger group. For the PX4, it's interesting because it's actually a modular type design for pretty much your sear and your hammer setup. That entire group can be interchangeable from gun to gun, so there's a lot of modularity to it, making the installation of it fairly easy. Now, in this trigger in a bag setup from Langdon Tactical, it included that, and they did do a little bit of stoning on the actual sear and all the components internally. And you do get the LTT trigger bar, which is where the magic of a lot of this happens. That's what creates the shorter reset. And additionally, I actually added the Gray Guns flat trigger. If you are pulling this thing through double action, that it does take a little getting used to, but once you get used to it, the pull is fairly natural, and as well as the reach. Now, if you're worried about reach, you are going to have to get your finger out there, but to give you a little idea, I do wear XL in mechanics gloves, so the reach isn't an issue for me, but I've seen people in my comments on other videos make comment about that. Looking at the single action component of this is that I like this flat setup for this reason here, because you're sitting right at 90 degrees and that pull through is light and minimal. In fact, I'm going to show you a couple of screen grabs of my PX4 right here. And it's interesting because there is a difference in the pull weight, which I really can't discuss on YouTube, but take a look at the one versus my GSD I get from Langdon and the dropping kit I just literally put in. Now, talking about that reset, of course you get the small and short reset that you would expect, and here it is. And that's it. And an easy break. Now this trigger job in a bag is a fairly straightforward setup. I did have to do a little fitting as the trigger bar was hitting the rear of the frame here, and so essentially it was not allowing it to reset in double action. So I just did a little light filing on there and it actually ended up working. So just bear in mind if you go through that there may be some fitting required. Now the PX4 is a fairly light recoiling gun to begin with, but shooting in 40, you do get a little oomph behind it, and so I opted to run the DPM recoil management system. Now, typically the DPMs on most guns come with a variety of different springs so you can tune it to your ammo, but in this case, for whatever reason, they opted to only go with a singular setup. Now, that setup is universal for both the 40 and the 9, which I found interesting. But putting it in the 40 cal really did ease the blowback a little bit, and the return to it was nice and gentle. Now, Langdon Tactical does make a stainless steel guide rod, which I do like quite a bit, and they have their own progressive recoil spring in it. Now, as far as the actual specs of it, at lockup, it's about 15 pounds. What it actually does for the experience of shooting this is that it puts a touch more weight out front. So I'd mentioned in my 5,000 round video that it was kind of a challenge for me to stabilize this gun shooting at distance with precision. So adding that little weight up there did help. Now, the way this is sprung, when it would return, it was a nice and easy, gentle return to 0. So I could actually track the dot well, and it was easy for me to call shots with. Now, there is one interesting point with the Langdon guide rod. I actually wanted to have an extra set of recoil springs in case they wore out at any given time. So what I did was I first reached out to MC, who is the maker of the spring, but they did inform me that the spring is proprietary to Langdon and to talk to them. So I talked to Langdon and they aren't offering a replacement spring at this time. However, they did say that in testing, they've gotten about 15,000 to 20,000 rounds out of a 9mm. So for what it is, it will last quite some time, according to that stat, but that is kind of weird seeing as how that $72 replaced that entire guide rod when you could replace the spring for, in theory, $10 or less. Now, the next setup in the spring is the hammer spring here. I opted to go with the 11-pound spring for all of my guns. I did in fact try the 10, and I'll get to that in a moment, but the 11-pound does the job. And if anything, I like the stacking it does create. Now that pull is going to be a little bit heavier, and I'll do a couple just to show you that. But from the factory, especially the PX4 and 40, it was a significant improvement. And when you're trying to get precision at distance with that double action, that does make a difference. Now, the one thing Langdon does mention is that the 11-pound is ideal for pretty much any type of primer out there. And I found that to be accurate whether I was in my 40 or any of the factory loads I was running. Now, when I went to the 10-pound, the pros of it is that that whole entire reach becomes a lot more linear in feeling because there is just less to pull through. So it's a positive in that sense, and it's easier to actually go through the double action. The downside is with some of the harder primers that I had on some of my ammo, it was having a challenge of lighting those off in double action. So that is the trade-off as you go lower in hammer springs. Now let's talk about the grips, because one of you in my PX4 5000 round update noticed that I had a brass backstrap on that. That was to add a little bit more weight to keep this gun stabilized at distance. And between the guide rod and this backstrap, that did help quite a bit, and added about 4 to 5 ounces over the factory. So on an already light gun, that does make a difference. Now, in terms of size, this is based on the medium backstrap that comes with the PX4. And if you notice, I actually have the Volker Precision grip tape on here. One thing I like about that is it does expose the front factory grip as well as the rear. So you can, in fact, take advantage of that nice grip back there. And one thing I found is with their particular texturing, it's a little bit more rubberized. So there is a little bit more opportunity for them to put a slightly more aggressive texture on there. Now I point that out because it has been popular to do the Talon grips in the past, and that's a full wrap all the way around it. And for me personally, I think I would prefer to go to the Volker, seeing as how it exposes the front and rear back straps, as well as it has a little bit more texturing to it. But I would say this is a little bit more friendlier for everyday carry. Now there is one catch with the brass backstrap I want to stop and tell you about, because if you're considering the Springer Magwell or their 140mm base pads, you're going to have to do a little fitting here to make this all work together, because when I originally put the Magwell on this gun, there was quite a bit of gap. That made it hard for the mags to seat. So I actually had to do quite a bit of filing and profiling to get that down. And those base pads I was talking about have a challenge with the placement of that screw that's used to retain that base pad to the mag. And what it does is it ends up hitting this backstrap. So you're going to additionally have to do some filing on that to make it fit correctly. It was a little easier on my GSD model, and I did have to just bevel out that area so that screw could fit on those extended base pads. Now back to our model gun here. One thing you'll see I added is I did the stealth decocker and slide stop. For me, the stock ones actually poke into my hands quite a bit with where I like to put my hand on the gun, so that was a positive for me, but it wasn't in the way of it operationally speaking or anything like that. And I do like these stealth decockers. They're just a little bit sleeker in design. Now, originally this decocker setup was it would decock it if you had it, and additionally this could stay down to keep it in a safe mode, but oddly enough that doesn't work in single action. So what you can do when you install this stealth decocker is that you can take the ball bearing out and make it a G model, which in fact makes it decocker only. That's fine. Now, as far as sights, I have the Ameriglow front and rear sights on this, and it's blacked out in the rear, but a giant orange one up front. Now, if you want to go red dot, Langdon is probably the go-to with this because at least their setup has an optic plate and co-witness setup, and you have a variety of different options of plates that they have, but I have this set up for a Trijicon RMR/Holosun, and I have a 507 comp, and the bottom side of the rear sight is lined up perfectly with the bottom of the 507. So there was a lot of thought that went into it. If you've been on my channel, you know I like to lean on data, and so I did do some baselining with this. Now, I was having trouble with some malfunctions on the transition drill, so I was only really to extrapolate data on the 25-yard bill drill. And here's the thing. Anything that you show up modification-wise will show up on the 25-yard bill drill and just translate over to a transition drill. And when I ran this the first time, really trying to get that down zero zone at 25 yards at speed was quite a challenge. And when you added the additional weight, the lighter pull as well as the amount of reset that's involved in this, I was able to significantly improve my 25-yard bill drill time with all this setup. If you're asking the question, is it worth getting the LTT upgrades or upgrading the PX4? For me personally, I would say yes. But here's the thing. We now know that we can get the PX4 to shoot better than it did from the factory. No surprise there, right? But as you start to do more to it, you're going to learn there are catches, and that is going to be the next part I'm going to talk about. But before I do that, I ask if you like this video, please hit that like button, as that helps me a lot. And you're going to want to subscribe because I'm doing a variety of good to great videos and I have tons of reviews coming out all the time. So you're going to want to subscribe. All right, so I'm going to relate this into magazines and reloads. When I talk reloads, I'm talking about everything involved in that. So from the time that you hit this extended mag release that I've added on, and by the way, pound for pound, it's the cheapest upgrade to do for $20. Now, the way the PX4 mags are designed are interesting because they do in fact hang up, and that was a big hitch point for me on my GSD video. And one thing I didn't mention in those videos, and I saved for this, is that I did something about that to make it a little easier. What I did was I trimmed out just a little piece off the side of the mag, and I'll leave more details on my website on what that actually looks like, but that made reloads significantly easier for me to do, especially when I didn't have a mag well. Now, I did mention on this full-size model that I had to do a little trimming on the back strap in order for this mag well to fit properly. And the funny thing I found out on this gun too is those screws that retain the base pads, specifically the 140mm, they do get hung up on this, and I actually had to file out a little bit of it out in order for it to fit in there properly. And I found that interesting because this being the Springer magwell and Springer base pads, I was surprised that it just did not work. Now, I did mention in my other video that it did have reliability issues related to those 140mm mags. This was a huge hiccup point for me. Now, bear in mind, if you want to keep it factory or you want to run the +0 base pads from Springer, the gun will function just fine. And you won't have to worry about the screws hitting the back strap, things like that, because they just slip in. But these 140mm mags were a giant headache. And why I have to use them is because in USPSA carry optic or limited optics, you have the option to run those size mags. And that does make a difference when you have 24 rounds at your disposal. So as you start to load these mags down, especially on these tall ones, when you get past 20, the rounds start to flatten out. The problem with that and the way the PX4 is designed is that it needs pressure under the nose to stay up. So effectively what it was causing was a nosedive into the backside of the feed ramp, and of course causing malfunction. And that happened a lot. So what I'm going to focus on is what did work, because I tried over 11 different combinations. I'm going to start with the easiest one you can work with, which is you can get a 22 round setup, and how you do that is you use Springer's extended power spring that comes with the base pads if you get that option. And really the only thing you have to do is trim the backside of the follower just a little bit. And I'll show you a difference between a stock follower and the one I have in there. And that one gets you a reliable 22 rounds. Now, oddly enough, we always have these odd 23, 24 round stages where if you're confident in your shooting and taking it to that limit, it becomes a big advantage in time savings because you may be able to do a reload in a more optimized position or not at all. And so I spent the most time trying to develop the 24 round. Now, the first 24 round, when I got to work reliability, you're gonna laugh, I used a 40 cal tube and a 40 cal follower from MBX, specifically a CZ one. And the reason why I did that is because you gotta bear in mind that the PX4 is designed around the 40 cals. The 9mm tubes just have these little indents to shrink it in a little bit, and that's it. But the 40 cal is using the full width. And my theory with that is if I could put a spring in there that wasn't so bound up, it could keep the nose of the round up. And so with a little bit of adjustment on the feed lips themselves, they worked, and they worked reliably. And I'll put the specs on my website about that. And the amazing thing is, if you're looking for 40 cal used mag tubes, there are plenty of surplus LEOs that are happy to get rid of them. Now, that's not as easy as an option as you guys would probably like to hear, because there is a 24 round option that will work with 9mm tubes, and that comes from CSRG. Now they did do an update to the follower, which in short gets more pressure underneath the nose of the round, essentially keeping it up where it needs to be. And I did get around to testing it. I did about 20 full cycles between two magazines, so about 40 tries at each, and they were functioning just fine for me. Now, the odd thing about the PX4 and these magazines is that some people can get them to work with other types of things, and then there's another half of it that just has a challenge with it feeding. And so if you're in that camp, look at CSRG as an option for spring and followers. Now I do have one final thing I need to touch on with these Springer base pads, and that is they do crack and break pretty easily. Now I have already reached out to Springer and shown them all 5 of the ones that are either starting to crack or are already broken, and I'll show all of them here for you guys so you can see them. But essentially I tried everything I could to reduce that likelihood, including dry firing on carpet and being mindful of my reloads when I was shooting indoor matches, and they still kept breaking. So I'm not going to speak to what's going on with that, but I could tell you that is something you're going to have to pay attention to, and hopefully Springer resolves. Now, I do want to talk about the competition component because there are a variety of different divisions you can run the PX4 in, and I'm going to focus on IDPA and USPSA to start. Now, with IDPA, I ran this gun that you see here. I occasionally would put the magwell on it, and I ran it in carry optics. Now for USPSA, believe it or not, I made this 40 cal for limited. And what was great about it is that as long as the magazines worked, this gun was an absolute riot to shoot. I mean, I could hammer this gun and drive it so hard that I arguably would say I'd be very competitive in limited with this setup. Now that magazine setup with the extended base pad runs at 20 rounds. And I would have to do a little bit more homework to get those to feed reliably, but it is a candidate for that. Now, the obvious divisions are going to be carry optics with this GSD model that I have there, as well as you add a magwell on it and you can run limited optics. But if you decide to keep irons on it, you could certainly do production or any other division out there, but you do have those options. Now, I want to touch on one final part here is what does your investment look like if you were to either buy it directly from LTT or do it on your own? Now, to keep this discussion apples to apples, I'm not going to talk about the sights, the trigger shoe, the backstrap, and the guide rod. I'm literally going to go off of Langdon's website and try to build it what you guys would see. Now, if you were to get the LTT RDO, obviously without the optic, you're looking just shy of $1,400. Now, if you wanted to go GSD, which is a little bit more pricey from Beretta, starting at $889, you're going to want to have that sent off to LTT, and that optic cut is going to run you about $300. And of course, the trigger job in a bag is going to run you $255 from LTT. That does not include the install, which I imagine would charge another hour or 2 at the most. So with that in mind, you're sitting at $1,438 for a total cost. So it's actually a little bit more. Let's say you already have a PX4. Really all you need to do to make it equitable is to add the trigger job in a bag and the stealth decockers and slide release and extended mag release. And you're looking at about $350 to $400 in parts. So that gives you an idea if you're saying, hey, I'm fine doing my own job and I already have a PX4. I can just drop this right in and do a little bit of work if necessary. Now that is everything I know about the PX4. Between all 3 of these guns, I have about 12,000 rounds between all of them, and so there has been some time put into this, but I want to hear from you guys. What do you guys think? Would you go all in on a PX4 and start competition with it, or would you consider upgrading it to improve your everyday carry situation? Sound off in the comments below because I want to hear about it. I will leave a full parts list on my website and I'll leave a link in the description for you guys. But I want you guys to remember this. Do not get the gun you love shooting. Get the gun that makes you love shooting. And until next time, we will see you all at the range.